Hello, I'm Amy. I actually just got a promotion there. I'm actually a reporter, not an editor at Sifted. And for everyone who doesn't know Sifted, we're the Financial Times' new media platform. We write about startups and tech across Europe, so please sign up to our newsletter. But I'm not here to talk about Sifted. I'm here to talk about Tink, which 2 years ago, as we heard, pivoted from a B2C business, the kind of business that journalists find very easy to write about, to a B2B. So tell us, what was Tink originally doing, for a bit of context?
So as we heard a little bit in the beginning, we did not start building cars, but we did start building something different. So me and my co-founder Daniel, we actually founded the company back in 2012. And to give you guys the full context, what we actually started doing in practice was that we launched an kind of independent, direct-to-consumer app or mobile service. It was all about kind of financial management. Basically an app you could download. You could connect all your financial institutions, your banks and credit card companies and so on. And we'd provide you a bunch of insights and advice and recommendations and so on. And you could actually manage your money in that app as well, because you could do payments and pay your bills and so on. So it's a standalone financial management app. But I think to provide even more context, I think it's for the later part of the discussion, I think it's interesting to come back to what really drove us initially to do this. Because the app we launched was actually not kind of a given idea or something that there's a great kind of founding story about, kind of me having issues with keeping my budgets or so on. But I think what both me and Daniel saw when we kind of started thinking about doing something new again was related to a lot of inefficiencies in one of the world's largest markets, which is banking, basically. And I think for us, when we thought about this, why banking at the time and still is not only one of the largest markets, but also one of the most ineffective markets, for us, and then there's a bunch of examples of that. I mean, in Sweden, for example, alone, 70% of all consumers hasn't switched a bank. Wow. They basically inherit their banks, right? So I think from our perspective, the reason why this market is and still is one of the most kind of inert or kind of illiquid markets in many ways is back to enormous kind of switching costs and kind of barriers to entry and so on.
Yeah.
And I think when we started to think about these problems, both what we actually executed our car on, but also our boat on, was that these problems really came back to a couple of monopolies that banks typically held. Those monopolies were kind of knowledge about consumers, because your bank was the only one who knew something about you, right? Yep. And they also had a monopoly on kind of infrastructure in terms of managing money and transferring funds and so on. And what actually got us started was not, as I said, that vision about this amazing consumer app. But it was a realization that if we could get access to the same data, if we could get access to the same infrastructure that the banks had, that could be kind of a systematic way of actually trying to improve this market.
Sure. So you were going along, you were getting customers, you had about 500,000 customers. What were the kind of signals that you were getting that made you think, maybe B2C isn't right, maybe we should swap?
So I think fast forwarding, so we launched the first, we started the company back in 2012. We launched the first consumer service in 2013. Over the first couple of years, I mean, it was as in all startups, quite the struggle, of course, but we also got some really good traction on that consumer journey. For example, we quite quickly grew the user base to 500,000 users in Sweden, virtually with no marketing, so found a quite nice kind of consumer kind of product market fit, if we kind of disregard the money side to that.
The business model.
Yeah. But then what happened later in 2015, 2016, was that there was a complete kind of mindset shift in the market. When we got started, when we did this, when we got access to this data by reverse engineering all the mobile banking apps in the Nordics, getting this data from the banks without their consent, of course with the consent of the end user, there was a lot of conflict. And we were kind of threatened, luckily not sued, but but we were absolutely persona non grata from the banks, right? But what happened back in 2015, 2016 was that it was basically two things. One, I think there was a general kind of mindset shift in that a lot of the industry started to realize that that the world was catching up to banking. A lot of new kind of both bank CEOs and kind of senior leadership in these banks realizing that if I'm going to make a difference for my bank or for me, I need to take more bold bets. I can't only focus on continuing to locking in customers and so on. So I think that was a kind of a generational shift almost in the industry. And the second reason was really that there was a lot of new legislation coming out. So we have the PSD2 directive on a European level, or European Union level, that basically regulates now what we've been doing since 2012, making it explicitly regulated, making sure that the banks can't block this and so on. So I think that also helped that the banks started to realize we can't only block, sue, stop, and try to subvert these guys. This is happening. We might as well try to, or might as well need to start to think about how we can leverage the type of technology that Tink has been building. So back to 2015, 2016, we started to get approached by a lot of industry players, like ABN AMRO in Holland, for example, was our first B2B partner or customer. And we were quite skeptical, to be honest, in the beginning about doing that. To be completely honest, there was no kind of super smart hidden agenda that we were going to go out, launch this consumer service, and then capitalize on it on a B2B fashion. Not at all. So we were quite skeptical in the beginning. We were on a mission to really change this industry. But eventually, I think both because of the persistence of these people, but also us kind of catching up, was that we realized that this was actually the way for us to get leverage on the technology that we were building.
So what was going on behind the scenes? How much were you communicating this with the team? Who was involved? Who were you speaking to kind of figure out, should we totally turn this way?
Yeah. I mean, at the time, Tink was still extremely small. I think when we signed our first B2B customer, when we decided, hey, let's try this out and see if this is actually both a model for us to grow our business, to have a larger impact on those inefficiencies, Tink was very, very small. I think we were around 11, 12, 13 people when we actually signed our first B2B partner. So Tink was absolutely a different place back then. I mean, communication was me and my co-founder being the only kind of managers, having an extremely talented team that was extremely kind of close and involved in those discussions, of course. But there was no brilliant kind of communication and so on. I think we eventually came to the conclusion, and as I said, still back to the smallness of Tink, this was obviously mostly a discussion between me and Daniel as founders and kind of management. I think as I said, we realized that this was something we wanted to try out. We were not kind of fully convinced that we should drop everything we do, take the technology and apply it in a platform business. But it was something for us to kind of learn and iterate from, really.
Yeah,
So we decided we wanted to try this out, and that was really how we, genuinely thought about it, as I mentioned, but also how we communicated it. I think that's a lesson that most startups learn. You need to kind of iterate, you need to learn. So that was basically how we thought about it.
And what about, were you looking at any other companies that had done something similar? Did you take advice from anyone about this?
Not really, to be honest, for better or for worse. I think we were somewhat in a unique situation in that we, kind of going back to what I was talking about before, kind of what really drove us to start the business in terms of improving kind of liquidity in the market. I think we saw an opportunity to not fundamentally kind of pivot the company or fundamentally do different things. We saw this more of a way to get leverage on what we were basically already doing, but in a much bigger fashion. Instead of reaching potentially 1 million or 2 kind of Nordic consumers directly, we could potentially affect hundreds of millions of users in a broader scale. We obviously had a lot of discussions on this, everything from on a board level type of discussions. We had at the time raised a small kind of venture or a small venture capital round from Danish investors, Hardcore, which coincidentally is a super kind of consumer-focused venture capital firm.
So what did they say? Were they, oh, no, don't do that?
I think they were extremely supportive. I think and I mean, Christian, who's on the board from Hardcore, has obviously seen these things play out before. I think he as a lot of other people in the industry, realized that this is kind of an opportunistic, or all of venture capital or kind of venture-backed startups is an opportunistic kind of game. You need to kind of adapt. You need to see different opportunities. You shouldn't kind of be super dogmatic about what you kind of set out to do. And I think that's quite shared, I think, in the industry. And I think that's something that most people are aware of.
So then fast forward to now, in the past year, you've gone from 100 employees to 270, from 3 offices to 10. What has that looked like internally? What really broke in the past year?
What really broke? No, but I think it's interesting. It's kind of hard to, I mean, for us, when we think about these types of questions, it's kind of hard to separate the pivoting aspect of it, as I mentioned, the quite slow pivot aspect of, to be honest. I mean, we started by actually signing our first B2B customer in 2015 and took the decision to be solely a B2B platform provider only in I think it was late 2017 or early 2018. So it was actually not a kind of a day-to-day kind of hard pivot in that sense. I think, and obviously the other aspect of it is that was the point in time when Tink started to hyperscale. So as you mentioned, we've gone through quite the rapid growth in terms of headcount, but also in the underlying business. When we signed that first customer, we were, as I said, around 11 people. When we decided to go fully platform, we were probably around 45, 50-ish, and now we're more than 270. So it's kind of hard to completely separate these perspectives, both the pivot, but also the hypergrowth, of course.
What broke?
Sorry?
What broke?
What broke? Yeah, always want the juicy stuff. But I think it is. Everything broke, to be honest. I mean, at different times, luckily. I think it's unreasonable to expect that you go through that type of growth with things working as they're supposed to. And that's something we try to remind everyone of on a frequent basis. It's how we close our kind of onboarding takeoff days when me and Daniel meet all our new colleagues. Like, things are going to break, unfortunately. Like, you can't embark on this type of journey with things not breaking. And I think the hard part is really that when you collect a bunch of brilliant people, really a bunch of super ambitious, super talented, super brilliant people on these types of adventures, it's not a problem of having people are not talented enough or people are not professional enough or anything. It is a natural kind of growing pain component to this. But the problem, I guess, is that these growing pains are typically disguised as something else. It's typically disguised as I think my boss is an idiot, or I think the team is working against me, or I think the other teams are idiots. And I guess that's the challenge to help the organization to realize that this is nothing else than growing pain. And I think I'm coming to a couple of broken examples, I promise. But I think that's the most important learning for us, that we need to be fully transparent. We need to remind every one of us, including ourselves, that things are going to break. That's a natural kind of state of growing a company more than 100% year over year. But if we need to talk about the broken things, I think it's it's pretty easy to find examples across the board. I think the common theme for all the brokenness, regardless if it's kind of organizational related or kind of technical related or anything, the common theme is really that it's typically you see it too late, of course. I mean, in retrospect, it is quite easy to identify these broken things as, okay, this is growing pain. We should have spent more time on building out the middle management layer, because the entire engineering team feels lost and don't feel that there's somebody kind of caring or looking or guiding for them. So I think what we have, what we probably should have done better, primarily and especially from the engineering perspective, is that we should have been more cognizant of the fact that you need to kind of front-load investment in a lot of things that might at the time, and especially as a founder, kind of starting out as two people, might sound silly. Everything from actually building an HR team, which we did only when we were like 30 people, from building out the first level of engineering managers, which we did when we were actually like 50 or 60 people.
Was that the right time, or should you have done it earlier?
Much earlier, much earlier. But it's also very hard to kind of take that, not cost, but kind of take that conscious decisions. Okay, we're now going to front load on kind of overhead.
Yeah. Because
that's really how it feels, very personally as a founder, of course. Like, why do we need kind of HR processes? Why do we need an HR team? That doesn't really come natural to you as a founder, kind of being scrappy, starting out as two people, hiring a bunch of super talented people.
Does it come naturally to the team either? Or is there some sort of, did you have a lot of resistance from them, like, oh, processes?
I think there was absolute resistance. And I think that's also quite natural. What was extremely rewarding, of course, was that I think the entire team realized the benefits of it as fast as we did. I think it was such an amazing realization. For example, when we hired our first HR person, who's now VP People, extremely talented individual, by far exceeded every expectations, and I think to a much higher degree than most roles. What an amazing impact it can be when you bring in somebody not only extremely professional in that overhead role as kind of a stupid, naive founder can feel about it in the beginning, and being extremely dedicated, extremely professional, extremely talented, and building out that team. So for us, it's been quite clear that we should have done these things earlier, but it doesn't come natural.
Yeah, and what about, you've got your engineering team is split across 3 different offices.
Yep.
How do you make, so you've got offices in Bratislava and Warsaw, how do you make them feel as much a part of Tink as the kind of core Stockholm team?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the things that we still haven't fully figured out. I think we've had a lot of discussions lately on everything from how do we see kind of remote work, for example. How do we manage that conflict or that problem with now having engineers spread over 3 or 4 offices? I think for us, initially we were quite kind of dogmatic from the perspective that we wanted to have everyone in the room. And I think that was actually one of the few things we actually did right in the beginning, and especially connected to the pivot part, because I think when you have so many kind of moving kind of what's it called, kind of external factors, like when you're changing quite fundamentally a lot of external factors, like business model, like the product we're building. I think it was imperative for us to have everyone in the room to really get through that challenge together. I think it would have been much harder if we were spread across multiple offices or having the amount of remote workers that we have today that early. I think for us, that was extremely instrumental. I realize that there's plenty of other ways of doing that as well. But I think from our learnings, the cost has really been when you try to do both things at the same time. I think it's interesting if you look at somebody like Stripe, for example, taking a conscious decision. Okay, we're going to build out a new engineering organization, which is remote, and they can optimize for that. And then we have 3 or 4 other engineering organizations that can focus on that. For us, we were a little bit in the between in the beginning, but then settled, okay, let's really build kind of the face-to-face aspect into the organization. And that was extremely helpful going through that pivot, especially. Now we're trying to learn how to handle these things better. Obviously, or unfortunately, part of that solution is actually getting together, meeting face-to-face, flying a bit too much or much more than you would like to. But obviously a lot of kind of technical tools that can help us nowadays. But it is extremely tough.
What about for you as the leader of that team? How from 100 to 270, from a few offices to a lot, how have you had to kind of adapt? What's worked, what's not?
So I think it's back to that point about iterating. I think that's something we haven't always done well. I think it's when you're a founder, especially, I guess, but when you're a small team and you want to kind of take giant leaps, it's quite easy to make very, very kind of sophisticated, grand plans and grand schemes about what you want to achieve. But I think it's hard to overemphasize the benefit of iterations. I think that's we've been good at to some degree and not good at from different perspective. I think building out the team, learning to handle separate offices, for example, in an iterative way. So, for example, we didn't decide to put up a new office, a new engineering office on the other side of the world, despite that might come with a bunch of pros, everything from working across multiple time zones and so that's a con as well, of course. But we actually set up our first or second engineering offices within the same city, a couple of blocks away, so we can actually start learning from these challenges in a very kind of niche fashion, right? So we would still be able to see each other quite often. We would still have kind of a very shared kind of cultural operating in the same country. But we would kind of start learning from these challenges of not being face-to-face in every aspect.
Okay, so if someone's tempted to have a remote team, they should like hire the office on the floor above and just like
exactly
try
that.
Out. Okay, and when you were doing that, when you were in different locations, just in Stockholm, what were some of the early sort of realizations you had about how to make remote working work?
I think it's back to what I said earlier. I think it's hard to over-exaggerate the benefit of actually meeting face-to-face. And it's sad how much you need to fly, for example, for that, but there's no other way in my mind. I think you need to build that personal bond, because then you mitigate 95% of kind of Slack misunderstandings, irony, jokes, everything. It's hard to over-exaggerate.
So for anyone who's growing, what's one thing you'd tell them, make sure you do not do this?
I think it's back to not waiting to provide or to invest in the support structures. I think that's, as I said, it doesn't come natural, at least not for me. As the kind of naive founder in the beginning, you want to build that kind of scrappy culture. You want to focus on delivery, on building things. And you feel it's kind of silly that we need to have all these processes and HR team and whatnot. And as I said, it doesn't come natural, but that would absolutely be my recommendation, to kind of front-load investments on that if you can.
Yep.
And that goes for everything from people to processes and steering, of course.
Okay,
yeah.
Amazing. We're out of time,
Yep.
but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Round of applause.